The first time I realized how strange the world of food could be was on a quiet evening inside an old research kitchen hidden behind a university greenhouse. Everything smelled faintly of dried herbs and steel. The shelves were lined with jars that held powders in colors I'd never seen in nature, deep blues, rust-colored reds, and shimmering silvers that sparkled under the lights. I was there to assist a scientist who believed every ingredient on Earth carried a secret, and every meal told a story older than civilization itself. Back then, I didn't understand what he meant. That night would change everything. That he handed me a small wooden box with no markings on it, only a faint scorch on the lid as if fire had once tried to claim it. Inside were two objects, an unassuming seed the size of a pebble and a brittle sheet of paper filled with delicate handwriting. The paper described an ancient tribe living somewhere in the mountains of Southeast Asia. According to the notes, this seed came from a fruit that could cause people to experience tastes entirely different from what they were actually eating. Sweetness became sourness. Bitterness became warmth. Spices felt like colors blooming across the tongue. It sounded impossible, yet the scientist's eyes gleamed with certainty. He explained that this fruit contained a compound capable of temporarily rearranging the taste receptors on the human tongue. Not poisoning them, not numbing them, just shifting the way they reacted. It was the first time I realized how fragile and mysterious our senses truly were. What we taste isn't always what exists. Sometimes, our brain writes its own recipes. As he spoke, I couldn't help imagining ancient people gathering around a fire, passing this strange fruit between them like a ritual. Maybe it was used to test bravery, or to confuse outsiders, or perhaps simply to create a moment of wonder when food transformed into something new with every bite. Science explained the mechanics, but not the mythology. The truth lived somewhere between the two. He instructed me to grind the seed into a fine powder, and I could feel the grainy texture between my fingers as the mortar pressed down. The scent that rose from it was unlike anything I'd ever inhaled, almost metallic, but softened by something sweet, like distant rain hitting warm soil. When the powder was ready, he sprinkled a tiny amount onto a plain slice of bread, asking me to taste it. My mind prepared for disappointment, but the moment the bread touched my tongue, it was as if a door unlocked. It tasted like citrus blooming across a summer valley, sharp and bright. Then, immediately, it shifted into something creamy and warm, like caramel melting over roasted almonds. A rush of flavors kept folding over one another, floral, smoky, almost electric. I hadn't eaten anything but plain bread, yet it felt like I was tasting memories of meals I'd never had and emotions I couldn't name. When the sensation faded, I stared at the scientist, unable to speak. "Food is never just food," he said in his usual calm tone. "It's chemistry, psychology, history, belief, fear, desire. It's a universe. And some parts of that universe don't like being understood." He turned toward another workbench where several sealed containers held samples of other mysterious ingredients he had been studying. One contained a moss that glowed faintly in the dark, used by ancient sailors to navigate shallow waters where stars were useless. Another held a freeze-dried powder harvested from a type of algae that, when added to boiling water, generated a sound almost identical to distant thunder. No one knew why. No one knew if it served a purpose. The world had simply never run out of mysteries. A sudden noise echoed through the room, something between a metallic pop and a hard snap. It came from a glass container at the far end of the shelf. Inside was a cluster of dried leaves gathered from a remote part of South America. The scientist had warned me earlier that these leaves were unusually reactive to changes in temperature, almost as though they were alive despite being long dead. Now, tiny cracks formed across the container's surface, spreading like spiderwebs. Before I could react, the lid of the jar bulged outward for a moment and then settled quietly, as if taking a breath. When the scientist approached it, he didn't look surprised or frightened, just thoughtful. He explained that these leaves released microscopic bursts of trapped gas when exposed to sudden changes in humidity. The tribe that once used them believed the leaves whispered warnings from their ancestors. Science framed it as a natural reaction. I wasn't so sure. Sometimes the boundary between belief and biology was thinner than a layer of glass. As the night deepened, he continued sharing stories of spices that could preserve food for longer than modern refrigeration, mushrooms that glowed when storms were coming, and roots that could trick the human brain into thinking it had eaten a full meal. Every tale blurred the lines between legend and laboratory fact. I found myself drawn deeper into the idea that food wasn't just something we consumed, it was something that consumed us too. It shaped our cultures, our rituals, our memories. It carried secrets that modern science still struggled to decode. I left the kitchen that night with the taste of impossible flavors still lingering in my mouth. The world looked different, almost as if everything edible around me held a secret waiting to be uncovered. I didn't know then that this was only the first step into a far larger mystery, one that would take me across continents and through forgotten stories hidden in markets, forests, archives, and ancient kitchens carved into stone. What I did know was simple: food had a power I never imagined. And whatever waited in the chapters still ahead, I sensed it would challenge everything I believed about taste, science, and the strange, beautiful world that grows around us and within us. The journey truly began a week later, when the scientist handed me a weathered notebook wrapped in soft leather. It had no title, no author, no indication of who wrote it, only the faint smell of old paper mixed with something earthy, like dried herbs that had been sealed away for decades. Inside were sketches of plants, diagrams of root systems, and pages filled with observations written in careful, looping handwriting. Some entries described ingredients I recognized, but most detailed foods I had never heard of, foods that seemed to exist somewhere between folklore and forgotten science. One particular page caught my attention. It described a plant known only as the silent blossom, found in dense mountain forests where sunlight barely touched the ground. The writer claimed the plant emitted no scent, produced no noise when touched, and attracted no insects, yet its petals glowed faintly whenever a storm approached. According to the notes, people in isolated villages brewed its petals into a tea believed to calm anxiety so profoundly that some described it as drinking quiet itself. Others believed it could help people remember events they had forgotten or suppressed. The scientist closed the notebook and looked at me with a seriousness I rarely saw in his expression. "We're going to find it," he said. I didn't ask why. Curiosity had already made the decision for me. 2 days later, we were on a narrow trail winding through the mountains of a remote region known for its dense forests and unpredictable weather. The air was cool and tasted faintly of pine resin. As we walked deeper into the woods, the sound of civilization faded, replaced by the low hum of insects and the soft rustle of leaves. The forest felt alive in a way I couldn't explain, as though it were breathing around us. The farther we walked, the thicker the trees grew, their branches arching overhead like an ancient cathedral. Hours passed before we reached a clearing where the ground was soft with layers of moss. The scientist knelt down, brushing his fingers across the soil. He didn't say anything at first, but the way he studied the earth made it clear we were close. Suddenly, he pointed to a small cluster of plants growing near a fallen log. They were unlike anything I had seen: tall, slender stems supporting petals so pale they were almost translucent. Even in the filtered light, they carried a soft luminescence, like moonlight trapped inside a flower. The silence around them was striking. No bees hovered near them, no birds perched on branches above them, not even the wind seemed willing to disturb them. The forest held its breath as we approached. The scientist took a small pair of shears from his pack and cut one of the blossoms with delicate precision. As he lifted it, the faint glow intensified for a moment, pulsing gently like a heartbeat. He placed it in a sealed container, handling it with the same reverence someone might use for a relic. I expected him to pack up and leave immediately, but instead he motioned for me to sit beside him on a patch of moss. He wanted us to observe the plant in its natural habitat before disturbing the balance too much. As we watched, clouds gathered overhead, casting shifting shadows across the clearing. The temperature dropped slightly, and a breeze stirred the canopy. The blossoms responded instantly. They brightened, then dimmed, then brightened again, their light pulsating in slow waves. It was like watching an organism communicate in a language I could not decipher. The forest darkened as thunder rumbled in the distance. The moment the first raindrop touched the ground, all of the blossoms dimmed to almost complete darkness, as if hiding from the storm. On our way back, the scientist explained that the silent blossoms' glow came from a unique chemical reaction triggered by changes in atmospheric pressure. The petals contained compounds that interacted with moisture and electrical charge in the air, creating a faint bioluminescent response. But that didn't explain everything. The lack of scent, the absence of insects, the eerie silence surrounding the plant, those were anomalies science couldn't yet fully account for. When we returned to the research kitchen, the scientist brewed the petals into a clear tea that shimmered slightly under the lights. He poured a small amount into 2 ceramic cups and pushed one toward me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I lifted the cup to my lips and drank that. Tea tasted like nothing. No bitterness, no sweetness, no temperature. It was as if my tongue had forgotten how to identify flavor. But the effect wasn't on my taste buds, it was inside my mind. Thoughts I hadn't considered in years resurfaced with clarity. Memories of childhood, conversations I'd forgotten, even scents I hadn't smelled in ages drifted through my awareness. It wasn't overwhelming, it was peaceful, as if someone had gently opened a drawer in my mind that had been stuck. The scientist watched me closely, not with concern but with deep curiosity. He asked if I felt anything unusual. I nodded, describing the sensation, and he wrote down every detail. When it was his turn to drink, he closed his eyes and remained silent for nearly a minute. I could tell the tea was affecting him too, though perhaps in a different way. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost reflective. This plant, he said, remembers the world differently than we do. In the days that followed, we conducted controlled experiments to understand the plant's effects. Volunteers described heightened intuition, temporary emotional clarity, or memories resurfacing unexpectedly. Some felt an overwhelming calm, while others experienced brief episodes of vivid imagination. The silent blossoms seemed to act on parts of the brain responsible for processing internal noise, the kind we carry with us every day without noticing. But something else happened too. Late one night, long after the volunteers had left, I found the scientist standing alone in the darkened kitchen. The container holding the blossom glowed faintly on the table. He didn't notice I was there at first. He was lost in thought, staring at the plant as though it held an answer he'd been searching for his entire life. He finally spoke without turning toward me. His voice was heavy. "This isn't simple chemistry," he said. "Plants don't evolve abilities like this without a reason." When he finally faced me, there was an unfamiliar urgency in his expression. "We need to understand what that reason is." The deeper we went, the more I realized we were no longer studying food in the ordinary sense. We were uncovering something older, something that blurred the line between nature and memory, biology and belief. And as the days passed, it became clear that the silent blossom was only the beginning. The days that followed drifted into a strange rhythm, half scientific procedure, half quiet wonder. Every morning, the scientist and I returned to the research kitchen before the sun fully rose. The silent blossom remained sealed inside a temperature-controlled box, yet even through the thick glass, it emitted a faint hum of light that pulsed like a slow heartbeat. We had studied unusual plants before, but this one felt different, as if it were studying us back. By the third week, word had spread quietly among trusted colleagues that our lab had discovered something extraordinary. Not everyone understood the importance, of course. Most believed we had simply found another rare botanical curiosity. But a select few sensed more. They arrived with clipped voices and cautious questions, people who didn't want to make their excitement too obvious. They asked about the plant's compounds, its neurological effects, the stability of its bioluminescent reactions. Each answer only deepened their fascination. One researcher, a neurochemist with a reputation for skepticism, visited the lab one afternoon. She examined the blossom for almost an hour, taking notes without speaking. When she finally straightened, she adjusted her glasses and rolled her shoulders back in a slow, tense movement. "This plant shouldn't exist," she said quietly. "Not according to what we know about evolutionary behavior." The scientist nodded, as if her words confirmed something he had already suspected but hadn't voiced. She leaned closer to the sealed container again, lowering her voice even further. "It's responding to us," she whispered. "Not chemically, intentionally." Those words echoed in my mind long after she left. That night, long after the rest of the building had gone dark, I found myself staring at the blossom through the glass. The lab lights were dimmed, leaving the flowers glow as the only illumination in the room. It cast a soft, pale light across the counter, enough to paint faint shadows on the walls. I moved closer, resting my hands on the table. The petals shimmered and then, very subtly, shifted in color, turning from a cool white to a faint blue that I didn't breathe at first. It took a long moment before I convinced myself it was just my imagination playing tricks, a tired mind interpreting the shimmer as a color change. But the glow felt deliberate, almost like acknowledgement. I stepped back, unsure whether to call the scientist or keep the moment to myself. Something inside me urged silence, as though speaking too soon might disturb a fragile thread. When I returned the next morning, the scientist was already there, scribbling notes on a whiteboard. His handwriting was tense, slanted, almost aggressive, as if he were racing against something unseen. Without turning toward me, he tapped the glass box with the blunt end of his marker. "It reacted again," he said. "During the night." I stiffened. "How?" "Light fluctuations. Rhythmic." He paused. "Coordinated." We stared at the blossom together. In the early morning light, it looked almost ordinary, still, quiet, obedient. But now we knew better. Something about its bioluminescence was not purely biological. It responded to environmental changes, yes, but also to presence, movement, and patterns of sound. It responded to us. The scientist finally broke the silence. "I think it communicates through light. Not consciously, not in the human sense, but, in its own way." He explained his hypothesis while pacing the room. The blossom lived in one of the most secluded forest environments in the region, a place where storms were frequent and sunlight was scarce. For a plant living under such conditions, light would be a precious resource, a tool, perhaps even a language. A way to coordinate among its species. But why react to humans? To test this theory, we set up a controlled experiment. The lab installed low-frequency sound emitters around the blossom's container, calibrated to imitate everything from wind vibrations to human speech patterns. We dimmed the lights and watched from the observation room. For the first 10 minutes, nothing happened. Then, as one of the sound emitters played a gentle tonal pattern similar to slow breathing, the petals slowly brightened. The scientist leaned forward in his chair. The blossom pulsed, dimming and brightening in response to the emitted tones. "It's mirroring us," he whispered. The rhythm of its glow shifted with every tone, reacting not just to sound but to cadence, almost like adjusting itself to the presence of a living being. It reminded me of how an animal might change its posture depending on who stood near it. But then something unexpected happened. When the tonal pattern stopped abruptly, the blossom's glow flickered. Fast. Erratic. Sharp bursts of light like tiny warnings. The scientist jolted from his seat and rushed into the main room, waving his hand in front of the container. The blossom's glow steadied instantly, returning to its usual slow pulse. He turned to me with an expression I had never seen on his face: fear. "We overstimulated it. No plant behaved like this. Not even remotely." The experiment was stopped immediately. The data collected was extraordinary, but something deeper, more fragile, felt at play. We had awakened a reaction, but we didn't understand its limits. Later that night, the scientist requested access to an archived database that stored old ethnobotanical records. If the silent blossom had been used in remote villages for generations, someone must have preserved their knowledge. Hours passed as he sifted through handwritten reports, faded photos, and translated field notes. Finally, he found something: a scanned page from a decades-old journal entry, written by an explorer who had visited a mountainous village known for its unusual herbal teas. The entry mentioned a glowing flower used in quiet ceremonies, never in daylight, never during storms. According to the note, villagers believed the plant could listen to the mind that drinks it. That phrase chilled me. The scientist read the entry 3 times, his expression tightening with each pass. Then he set the journal down and rubbed his forehead with both hands. We're dealing with something more than neurochemistry, he said. This plant has interacted with humans for generations. They knew its effects long before science named them. Days went by, and the atmosphere in the lab changed. Curiosity became caution. Excitement turned into a quiet tension. The blossom's bioluminescent pulses sometimes shifted without any clear trigger. We recorded every fluctuation. Sometimes the glow brightened when we entered the room. Sometimes it dimmed. Once, late in the evening, it emitted a faint color shift, pink, fleeting, almost invisible. It had never done that before. At the same time, the tea brewed from its petals continued to affect volunteers in strange ways. One person reported remembering an entire childhood song they thought was forgotten. Another left the lab in tears, claiming they suddenly understood a fear they had carried for years without knowing why. A third described feeling as though the room was listening. The scientist visited each volunteer individually, documenting their experiences with an intensity that bordered on obsession. I could see the plant's effect on him as well. His curiosity had sharpened into fixation. He rarely slept, often staying in the lab past midnight, scribbling notes that filled entire pages with theories. Some ideas were rational, grounded in biology. Others were more speculative. Almost philosophical. One night, I confronted him. He was sitting alone at the counter, staring at the blossom again, his eyes glassy with exhaustion. You're pushing yourself too hard, I said. We need to slow down. He didn't look away from the flower. We don't have time. For what? I asked. He finally turned toward me, and the look on his face made my chest tighten. His eyes were filled with a mixture of wonder and dread. This plant, he whispered, is adapting. I frowned. Plants adapt all the time. Not this fast. He moved toward the whiteboard, pointing at a list of recorded light patterns from the last week. The pulses had become more complex, longer sequences, varied intensities, subtle shifts in hue. Almost like patterns. These aren't random, he said. It's learning. The room went still. For the first time since we discovered the silent blossom, I felt something settle into my mind, a quiet realization, heavy and unnerving. Whatever this plant was, whatever history it carried, whatever memory it stirred inside us, it wasn't done revealing itself, and the deeper we went, the more I suspected that understanding it would require confronting something far older, far stranger, than anything science had prepared us for. The storm arrived without warning, one of those sudden, violent mountain tempests that seemed to appear from thin air, as if summoned by something unseen. The sky darkened in minutes, clouds folding into each other like layers of black cloth. The wind rattled the windows of the research building, and thunder rolled across the valley in slow, heavy waves. Inside the lab, the lights flickered, and the silent blossom, resting in its sealed glass chamber, began to glow brighter than I had ever seen. It was not the soft, pulsing shimmer we had grown accustomed to. This was different. Urgent. Almost frantic. The petals emitted a cold, pale radiance that cut through the dim room like thin blades of luminescent glass. The glow expanded, contracted, then expanded again, as if the plant were breathing rapidly. The scientist rushed to the control panel, typing commands into the monitoring system. His hands were shaking. For months, we had observed the blossom responding to changes in air pressure before storms, but never like this. This was not a reaction. It was a warning. A sharp crack of thunder hit directly above the building, followed by a momentary blackout that plunged the room into complete darkness. In the blackness, the blossom became the only source of light, its glow spreading across the walls like ripples in water. When the backup generator came on, I realized something unsettling. The pattern of its light pulses had changed again, not random. Not rhythmic, intentional. The scientist stared at the data feed on the monitor, watching the bioluminescent spikes scroll across the screen like a coded message. His face paled. It's communicating at a frequency we haven't seen before, he said. The storm is triggering a higher level of response. Another roll of thunder rumbled through the valley. The building trembled. The blossom flared with a sudden burst of white-blue light that forced both of us to shield our eyes. When the glow settled, something else changed. The faint hum that accompanied its bioluminescence, the soft vibration we once assumed was merely a byproduct of the plant's natural chemistry, had grown louder. Clearer. Resonant. Like a note struck on a glass instrument, sustained and pure, the sound made the air feel thicker. Heavier. Are you hearing that? I whispered. The scientist nodded, frozen. Sound doesn't just appear. The plant is producing it. We watched in silence as the blossom pulsed again. The hum deepened, layered with another tone beneath it, subtle at first, then stronger. Together, the tones formed a harmonic resonance that made my chest tighten, as if my lungs were matching the frequency. Involuntarily I stepped back, but the sensation followed me. Then I noticed something else. The petals were moving, not curling. Not wilting. They were shifting position in tiny, precise motions, opening, closing, tilting slightly as if aligning themselves to the vibrations in the air. Slow, deliberate adjustments, like someone tuning a delicate instrument. The scientist grabbed his notebook, flipping to a fresh page. His writing was frantic, uneven. This isn't adaptive behavior, he muttered. This is coordinated physical response. It's processing information at a rate that shouldn't be possible for a plant. Another surge of light cut across the room. The petals shifted again. That's impossible, I whispered. He didn't disagree. The storm outside intensified, rain hammering the roof, wind howling through the vents. Lightning flashed repeatedly, illuminating the lab in harsh bursts. Each time the lightning struck, the blossom responded, glowing brighter, shifting color, adjusting its shape, it's synchronizing with the electrical field, the scientist said, voice trembling. It's reacting to the storm's energy. Suddenly, the glow dimmed. All at once. As if the plant had inhaled and held its breath. We froze. The hum, the tone that had been rising steadily, stopped. Total silence. Then the blossom emitted a single pulse of light. Sharp. Focused. Directed not outward, but toward the scientist. Before either of us could process what happened, he staggered backward, clutching his head. Papers fell from his hands. His knees buckled, and he collapsed onto the floor. I rushed to his side, but he held up a shaking hand, signaling me to stop. His breathing was shallow, erratic. What happened? I asked, panic tightening my throat. He swallowed hard, eyes unfocused. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. It showed me something. I stared at him. What do you mean? He shook his head, struggling to form words. Not a memory. Not mine. Not anyone's. Something older. Something the plant remembers. Lightning flashed again. The blossom responded with another pulse, faint but deliberate. The scientist forced himself upright against the counter, gripping it tightly as though grounding himself. I saw a forest, he continued. But not the one where we found it. Older. Wilder. Darker. And I saw the blossoms growing, hundreds of them, moving with the storm, not reacting to it. Connected to it. His voice broke, and he looked at me with eyes full of something I had never seen in them before. Fear. They weren't just part of the forest, he whispered. They were guiding it. A chill ran through me. How is that possible? I asked. He shook his head again. It wasn't just an image. It was information. A sensory memory passed through light. The building shook as thunder struck nearby. The blossom brightened again. That pulse, he said slowly. It wasn't random. It was directed at me. It was deliberate. The implication hung heavy in the air. The plant had communicated. Not with chemical signals. Not with light patterns. But with something deeper, something that reached inside the mind. The scientist steadied himself, taking slow breaths. We misinterpreted its behavior, he said quietly. The glow, the pulses, the tonal resonance. I leaned closer. What are you saying? He looked at the blossom, a strange mixture of awe and dread etched into his features. "It's not adapting to us," he whispered. "It's evaluating us." The storm outside cracked with another blast of thunder, shaking the windows. The blossom responded instantly, another pulse, this one aimed at me. I gasped as a sudden wave of warmth rushed through my head, brief, dizzying, like the moment before fainting. I grabbed the counter to steady myself. My vision blurred around the edges, and for an instant, just a heartbeat, I saw something flash behind my eyes, a forest bathed in dim light, petals glowing like stars on the forest floor. A storm swirling above, lightning branching across the sky, and hundreds of blossoms pulsing in perfect, synchronized rhythm, like a living network. Then the vision vanished. The scientist was at my side instantly, gripping my shoulders. "What did you see?" he asked urgently. I struggled for air. "A forest. Light. Storms. The blossoms, they were connected." Understanding washed over him in a slow, terrible wave. "It's communicating through shared sensory memory," he said. "It's not just recalling. It's sending." Another lightning strike. Another pulse from the blossom. This time, neither of us doubted its intention. It was trying to show us something important, something it had carried for centuries. The scientist looked at the glowing petals, his jaw tightening. "We need to go back," he said. "To the forest where we found it." My heart pounded. "Why?" He turned toward me, eyes steady. "Because whatever this plant is trying to tell us, it didn't start in the lab." A low hum filled the room again as the blossom brightened, as if answering his words. It wanted us to return, and deep down, I realized the same thing he did. The silent blossom wasn't just a plant with unusual properties. It was a messenger, and we were only beginning to understand its message. We did not wait for the storm to pass. By dawn, the clouds still churned overhead, but the rain had slowed to a thin curtain that hung over the valley like a veil. The scientist packed equipment with a speed that bordered on recklessness: field monitors, portable containment units, thermal scanners, notebooks, vials, emergency lights. His movements were sharp, purposeful, driven by a conviction so intense it cast a shadow across the room. The blossom, still glowing faintly inside its chamber, pulsed once as we prepared to leave. A soft, steady light, nothing like the violent bursts from the night before. It felt like acknowledgement. Or permission. The scientist paused beside the container, resting his hand lightly on the glass. "We're going," he said softly. "We understand." The plant pulsed again. We began the climb back into the mountains the moment the first hint of weak daylight pushed through the clouds. The trail was slick with water, turning each step into a careful calculation. Mist clung to the trees, drifting like pale ghosts between the branches. The forest felt quieter than before, no birds, no insects, not even the distant rustle of animals. It was as though the entire mountain was holding its breath. Hours passed in tense silence until we reached the clearing where we had first discovered the silent blossoms. The ground was wet, puddles reflecting the gray sky. But something felt wrong. The cluster of blossoms we had seen weeks ago was gone, not wilted, not trampled, gone. The moss was undisturbed, the soil looked untouched, the forest offered no sign that the flowers had ever existed. The scientist approached the spot slowly, kneeling to examine the ground with trembling fingers. His breathing quickened. "This is impossible," he whispered. "Plants don't vanish. Not like this." He reached into my pack for a scanner and swept it across the soil. The device beeped sharply, detecting something beneath the surface. Something faint. "Something alive, here," he said. "There's a root system still present." But the blossoms, they withdrew. I didn't understand. Withdrew where? He stood slowly, scanning the tree line with narrowed eyes. "They moved." The idea hung between us like a cold mist, unbelievable and yet undeniable. The scientist pressed deeper into the clearing, studying the small rises and dips in the earth, the moisture levels, the faint traces of bioluminescent residue left on the moss. "They didn't disappear," he said finally. "They relocated. As a group." Before we could process the implications, a faint flicker of light shimmered in the distance, barely visible, like the last spark of an ember buried under ash that we both turned. Another flicker, then another. Small pulses of pale blue radiance blinked through the trees, not randomly, but sequentially, one after another, tracing a path deeper into the forest. "They're leading us somewhere," I said. The scientist didn't question it. He grabbed the equipment and stepped toward the first flicker. The moment he did, the second pulsed brighter. And the third. Like signals being passed along a chain that we followed, the deeper we went, the dimmer the daylight became. The trees grew taller, their trunks thick and ancient, covered in dark moss. The ground sloped downward into a secluded basin we hadn't known existed. The air grew colder, heavy with moisture. My breath lingered in front of me in faint clouds. Then the forest opened, and we found them, hundreds, maybe thousands, of silent blossoms covered the ground, their faint glow lighting the basin like starlight scattered across dark earth. They pulsed in slow, perfect synchrony, as if sharing a single heartbeat. The scientist inhaled sharply, awe softening his normally stern features. "It's a colony," he whispered. "A living network." We stepped toward the luminous field, careful not to disturb the fragile ecosystem beneath us. The glow intensified as we approached. A soft hum vibrated through the basin, rising from the flowers themselves, resonating through the air, through the soil, through us. I felt it in my chest first, a steady, gentle rhythm, then in my head, pressure behind my eyes, warm and diffuse, then memories, small, quiet moments, surfaced without warning. Laughter from a forgotten afternoon. A conversation I didn't know I remembered. The smell of a room that no longer existed. The blossoms brightened, "They're connecting," the scientist whispered, voice trembling with emotion and fear. "Not with our senses, but with our memories." He stepped forward again, until the glow surrounded him. The ground beneath the blossoms pulsed, like the earth itself was breathing. The scientist knelt, running his fingers lightly over the moss. His eyes widened. "They're all connected underground. A single organism. A shared root system. A biological network. A collective memory. An intelligence older than any human settlement in these mountains. A sudden flash erupted from the center of the basin. Not white. Not blue. But deep gold, warm and enveloping. The blossoms responded instantly, their pulses tightening into a rapid, unified rhythm. The scientist whispered, "It's communicating." The golden light intensified, then the pulses shifted direction, toward us. I staggered backward as another wave hit me, not physically, but inside my mind, a rush of impressions, sensations, colors too complex to name. And threaded through them all, images, a storm-lashed forest, centuries old, villagers kneeling in silent reverence, hands gathering blossoms with gentle precision. A ceremony of light shared between people and plants. A pact, ancient, respectful, reciprocal. When the pulse faded, I gasped for air and fell to one knee. My heart raced, but the sensation inside my mind was not fear, it was understanding. The blossoms were not manipulating memories. They were awakening them, teaching through shared experience, shared perception, shared history. The scientist touched my shoulder, steadying me. "They remember everything," he said quietly. "Every storm. Every human who ever used them. Every change in the forest. Centuries of memory stored in their network." He stepped into the center of the glowing field. The blossoms brightened, forming a circle of concentrated light around him. "They brought us here for a reason," he said. "They want to show us something else." A deeper hum resonated from the ground, vibrating through the earth like the distant roar of a shifting glacier. The gold light flared again, massive, overwhelming. Then we saw it, not a memory, not a vision, but a warning. Trees collapsing under violent storms far stronger than the ones we knew today, rivers swelling beyond their banks, soil eroding, roots exposed, blossoms struggling to hold the ground, storms growing, seasons shifting, the forest losing its balance. The blossoms pulsed faster, desperate. Their light intensified until the entire basin glowed as bright as a lantern. The message was unmistakable: they had survived countless storms, but the storms to come would be different, stronger, unpredictable, and the forest, their home, was in danger. "We thought they were responding to the environment," the scientist whispered, voice breaking. "All this time, they were anticipating it." The golden light dimmed slowly, returning to a gentle white glow. The colony waited. The scientist turned to me, his face filled with a quiet, heavy understanding. They need help. They brought us here because they can't survive what's coming alone. I looked down at the glowing field. When we discovered the silent blossom, we thought we were studying it, but all along, it had been studying us, evaluating whether we were capable of listening, and now that we had listened, it offered us something fragile, ancient, and profound, a chance to protect the memory of the forest. The hum faded, the pulses softened, the blossoms dimmed to a resting glow. And the scientist spoke the only words that felt true. "We'll help you," he whispered. The entire basin brightened, soft, steady, grateful. As if the forest itself exhaled in relief, and in that moment, I realized the truth. This was no longer a story about strange food, unexplained science, or mysterious plants. This was a story about connection, between nature and memory, between storms and survival, between humanity and something far older. And the silent blossom, glowing quietly beneath the ancient trees, was not just a plant with secrets. It was a guardian of the past, a messenger of the present, and now, whether we were ready or not, a partner in protecting the future.